Welcome to Lesson 7, PSRM Fundamentals Overview. We'll be discussing payments. We will be introducing this financial transaction, the second one that we're looking at after adjustments, and also introducing you to something called dynamic credit allocation, how those payments are allocated to the different assessments and adjustments. We will be showing how debt category priority affects this credit allocation, and we'll be creating a manual payment as well directed to the tax form. Example that we're using store BBB, and look again at the financial information, and you will see that we have been discussing this left-hand column, and we've seen the different assessments related to this particular obligation, the first quarter of 2014. Now let us look at the second column, amount collected, which is related to payments. And if you remember, we have a this came from a tax form, and if we go back for a moment, we can actually create a second tab and look at our this is actually gives us an opportunity to actually go back and look at the account tree, and you will see that we can see information which we saw previously in tax rolls. One of the things we can also see is form history, and we can see the forms that were frozen. And actually, let's go back to this particular form that we had, which was the original one, which we're going to look at. Remember, there was also an amendment as well. And if you remember that we had on the line items, we sent in a payment for 1,000. And because we added in a payment for 1,000, then just put that across here. We can use this for so the 1,000 payment is actually shown on financial information here. If I click on this 990, it will show below the particular financial transaction related to that payment. In fact, this is split. This 1,000 is split between this and this, because the 990 pays off the assessment amount. There's an extra 10 and can pay partially for the failure to file penalty. So that is why you actually, when you click on there, it shows 1,000, because both of them are pointing to the same financial transaction. Now, if I actually click on that financial transaction, it will take me to FT as we saw earlier. This one is a payment segment. Again, the effective date of this payment segment was the date at which I filed the return. And I filed the return on the 30th of December, and that is why we get an effective date of the 30th of September. And we can actually go to the payment segment, and it takes me to something called the payment event, and it shows me the event in more detail. Now, payment event has underneath it payments and payment segments, and there are many other entities related to payments. In fact, in this particular product, PSRM, we don't really need to use, and we don't really in a simple functionality, don't use payments and all its entities too much. There's in fact many other entities related, also including something called tenders, and as a tender control and deposit control. There's an ability to actually have one person not paying a different person's account, and in fact the whole structure of the different entities of payment are quite complicated. We don't again need to use very much of this functionality within PSRM, and I'm not going to show that to you now. Most important parts here are the ability to actually create a payment, and I'll show you that in a minute, and to cancel it. And to cancel a payment, you go to the tenders and you cancel the payment. How do you add in a new payment manually? We saw how you could do it through a tax form, and that was added in through a form rule. How do you do that manually? Well, the main part, we have a payment menu, and you'll see there are many options here, but as I said, we don't need to use nearly any of these. Deposit control and tender control we're not going to discuss, but the one which is easy to use is called the payment event quick add. And this has the ability to actually add a new payment directly and pay a particular tax form. So you actually compare tax form by adding in here the document locator number. So if I actually go back here and take this value, and then I just simply add in my amount that I'm going to pay, and I'm going to do at the moment the balance is 603. I'm going to just pay off 250, a check for 250. I can actually do that. I can even do multiple and do it twice, but I'll just do one for now. I just can click, and that's my payment date. I will just create this payment. And we'll see how it affects the balance, and you see the balance is affected. If I go back to my tax form and go back to 360-degree view, you will see under financial information, again, this has not been refreshed yet. As I mentioned, sometimes you need to refresh to get the current context to be updated. You will see now that we have enough, well, what do we see? We have the 990 related to the original payment from the tax form, and we have the whole of the failure to file penalty being paid, and it's paid by two financial transactions, partially by the 100 and partially by the 250 that we paid in. And then you have the rest of the 250 is paying off some of the failure to pay penalty. Okay, and perhaps the most important thing to understand with payments is the fact and how the decision is made about which particular debt categories to pay off and in which order. And we will see that is an important part of the setup of the obligation. So if I actually go back to the financial transaction, this is the payment, and I can go and find this, because if I go to the payment, I can find the obligation. Okay, that just, here's my obligation, sorry. I missed that. I should have gone there initially. This is the obligation, and the obligation has an obligation type, as we know. And if I go to the obligation type, you will see that there's something called the debt category priority, and this is the order in which the payments are going to pay off the different debt categories. So it will pay the tax first, and then the failure to file, and the failure to pay. So if we actually, sorry, if I need to go back to the view again one more time. As you see, it paid off the tax first, then failure to file, and then failure to pay, and that is reflected here. Tax, failure to file, failure to pay, and then only at the end interest. So the interest has not been paid off yet. So we will look at that and change that and see how that is affected by changing. In fact, we can do that right now. I can, if I actually do this, if I change this to, let's say, interest first, and I save that, and I go back to my 360 over here, you will see that now interest has been paid off first, then what was the next one? Then tax, and then failure to file, and then failure to pay. Okay, so that's changed the order. So this is actually called dynamic credit allocation, and this is being changed on the fly. The financial transaction of the payment has not changed at all, but you can imagine that if the payments are directed to different debt categories, then the actual debt categories themselves, even the penalties and interest, might be affected as a result. So we'll discuss that later on when we look at P&I. But what you see here is how payments are created both manually and through the tax form, and how they are directed at debt categories based upon the debt category priority. I'm just going to put that back to how it was previously. And you should see this now reflected back to how it was previously. Okay? So what have we seen? We have seen that there is a payment which is associated with a financial transaction, and is also associated with obligation. And it is the second type of financial transaction that we have talked about. Earlier in this chapter, this lesson, we looked at adjustments and a specialized case of adjustment assessment where the group FT is the same as the FT. And we've talked about the importance of debt category throughout to sub-categorize debts into debt category, and how payments pay off by way of the debt category priority. And this slide, you can have a look at for a moment. This is actually a lot of the payment information that we're not covering in this course, in this particular lessons, because as I mentioned, payments are not used, not used that much. And I just want you to know that you will, if you look at the application, you look at PSRM, you'll see payment events, tenders, and there's also deposit control as well. And you have the ability to have a payee, and it's different than the payer. And it's something called a distribution rule, which decides which obligations are paid off, and that pay a tax form, which we saw on the quick add payment, is an example of a distribution rule. But again, in the sense for payments is more is less. It's better to actually understand the most important aspects of how payments are used for PSRM, and I think that we have covered what we need to do in order to understand payments for PSRM.